Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. This time we're going to be talking about the Atlantic Revolutions, the United States and France. Next time we're going to keep the Atlantic Revolutions going, looking at Haiti, and then the revolutions that are all across Central and South America. Basically, as you see, these are all going to be a product of the Enlightenment thinkers in the United States and Europe, but they're going to have really wide-reaching consequences. That change the way people think of how states should operate, what freedom is all about, all that sort of stuff. So let's get right into it. The revolutions in the United States and France were all built on these Enlightenment ideas and new liberal ideology. That might not sound like much, but we'll get to it. What does that actually mean? To understand it, first we'll look at the Enlightenment, then we'll look at the American Revolution, and then we'll look at the French Revolution. You might have heard an awful lot about the American Revolution in school and stuff already. Hopefully we can get some new stuff there, make that a little bit more interesting. So the Enlightenment is a school of sort of philosophy and thought, religious thinking that was built on top of those scientific revolutions and changes we saw in Europe a couple of classes ago. They start with this guy, Isaac Newton, in a sense. He was a scientist, mathematician, but also had a bunch of ideas about why things worked the way they did, and one of the ideas that he had was about natural laws. And basically what he argued was everything happens for a sort of reason, and using our minds, using evidence, using sort of scientific ways of understanding, we can find out what those reasons are. And once we do, we can start to establish some principles by which the universe must work. For example, his laws of motion, or understanding how light works, things like this. Understanding that gravity is what moves, right? The apple that fell on his head, and also the planets around the stars, right? We kind of looked at that before. So what the Enlightenment is going to do is pick up on this sort of sense of natural laws, but take it into all kinds of new areas. So the Enlightenment thinkers thought, yeah, there is a way things work, and we as human beings can figure this out. And we can apply it to all kinds of different areas of life. For example, John Locke was an Enlightenment thinker, and he was going to apply these ideas to the way that governments work. So he argued against monarchies, and he argued for constitutions. He tried to solve problems of the commons and all these sorts of things. And he said, look, politics, just like anything else, must have a reason it works the way it does, a sort of law to it. Another philosopher who tried to do the same thing in terms of natural laws for society or for politics was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In an ideal society, he argued every individual would participate directly. People are all sort of bound together through a social contract, if you've heard that term before. We all kind of agree to a certain type of society that we live in. That's why there's sort of written and unwritten rules. Adam Smith, who you might know is sort of the founder of capitalism, actually he was writing a lot about mercantilism, which is slightly different, but don't worry too much about that, sought to apply these natural rules to the economy. And he developed some principles, some thoughts, the idea of supply and demand that you guys have heard a lot about, I'm sure, or the idea of an invisible hand, this notion that something is sort of magically raising the economy up on its own or lowering prices on its own. You don't need government interference. You don't need the king to make an order about how much wheat should cost. The price of wheat will regulate itself. There's a sort of unseen mover in markets, right? We have this idea. So all of these are sort of what the Enlightenment was like, what these sort of thinkers were doing. Natural laws, not just for science, for all kinds of realms of human behavior. But there were other Enlightenment thinkers that are kind of along a slightly different line. Here you have Voltaire, who was a writer. Francois-Marie Aldo, his like real name there. But anyway, he wasn't necessarily writing about natural laws for the economy or politics. He used a lot of humor. He used a lot of wit. He wrote thousands of letters that we still have, right, because people saved them. He wrote dozens of books, and he made fun of the Pope, he made fun of the king, he made fun of people in positions of power, much like a lot of comedians do today. And the idea was you should be punching up, that's great, because the people above us in positions of power often exercise that power in seemingly unfair ways, or use it to their own advantage, or are hypocritical in terms of the use of their power. But what really makes him an Enlightenment thinker is his sort of love of freedom, his idea of individuality. He's opposed to oppression in sort of any of its formats. So this sort of thought you see a lot. You don't have to necessarily be a philosopher per se. You could be a playwright, you could be an artist. There were all kinds of other ways to engage with this sort of movement. One particularly important aspect of this sort of Enlightenment thought, at least from the American context, was the idea of deism. It's a sort of version of Christianity, and a lot of the founding fathers and sort of early American revolutionaries were deists. They believed in a sort of creator God, they believed in the Bible, but they denied the sort of what they described as magical or supernatural elements of Christianity. Instead, they say, look, clearly something made the universe, let's call that God. There's a natural order to the way things work. We can discover these things through studying the Bible, through studying the religion, through sort of feeling an understanding of nature. This is a rational universe we live in, and there must be a reason for it. And the sort of particulars of Christianity dissolved, just with God sort of being the reason for the universe's existence or sort of rational order, which actually fits in really well with the New Testament, right? In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was good. Okay. That's not actually what it says. A much better translation would be, in the beginning there was a sort of rational order, and that rational order was good, and that rational order was with God, and that rational order was God. That'd be a better, sort of translation from the Greek. But anywho, so Thomas Paine was one of the sort of early American revolutionaries who wrote a lot. He's sort of the quintessential example of a deist thinker. He wrote The Age of Reason, he wrote Common Sense, a lot of really influential sort of books on early American consciousness. And he often used this sort of idea as the sort of God as a watchmaker sort of narrative. And it goes like this. If you're walking through the woods and you look down on the trail and you find a pocket watch, I guess today it would be a cell phone, just finding that implies that someone out there made it, right? You can't have a cell phone unless there's people who make them. You can't have a stopwatch unless there's someone who makes it, whatever. So you pick it up and you start looking at it. You can take it apart. You can figure out how it works. There's a reason it works. He says basically the universe is like this. The fact that we find ourselves in an inhabited universe implies that there is something that made the universe. And we can take it apart, we can study it, we can look at it, we can find out the way it works. It doesn't take away from the fact that something made it at some point. So that's sort of the classic deist example for the role of God within this much more sort of scientific and rational version of Christianity. Another thing that comes out of the Enlightenment that's really just essential to the Atlantic Revolutions and the idea of the United States, and lots of sort of common thought amongst elites during this time, is the idea of progress. So one of the big aspects of the Enlightenment was using our minds, using our sort of human gifts, always trying to be better. We could, as individuals, create a better world. We could, through our choices, become better people. You can constantly kind of go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. This is a very sort of logical, reasonable idea, but it doesn't necessarily mesh well with a lot of other ideas. So for example, in the classic sort of Christian sense, the world is going to end any old time. Right? The early followers of Christ, for example, thought the world was going to end like in the next couple of years. But so we live today because the world's going to end soon, and etc. But the idea of progress isn't like that. Like the world's always changing, it's always developing, it's always getting better. There's not necessarily an end. It's more about improvement. And this is kind of hard to understand completely divorced from the context of the time, because now all we think of is progress. It's completely ingrained in us. If I do this and this, I can get a better job. If I do this diet, I can be a better person. If I start doing this action, taking this action, I can be a better husband, whatever, right? There's all these narratives about how to progress, how to be better at who you are. That time is going to like kind of keep on marching and take me somewhere else. And in a way, this concept has a lot of freedom in it. Who I am today is not who I have to be tomorrow. I can change, I can grow, I can develop. This doesn't, it gets rid of the idea that people are static or that there's only one way to do things. So this idea of progress is completely embedded in the Enlightenment and completely embedded in the founding of the United States and all sorts of institutions that developed during this time. One of those institutions that's incredibly popular is the idea of popular sovereignty. So until this point, basically throughout history, governments were run by and for the government. If you have a king, the king doesn't particularly care what the peasants out in the field think when they're harvesting wheat and potatoes and stuff. The government works for the king at the decree of the king, etc. But with the Enlightenment and all of these thinkers debating all kinds of new political ideas and social ideas, there was a new one that came up, that this idea that people are what the government is for. And instead of having a government, decreed by God or based solely on military power, the government should work for the people, they should be by the people. That was a shockingly new idea that undermined monarchies, it undermined traditional sort of economic structures, it undermined all kinds of thinking that aristocrats and nobles had had for a very long time, and it creates all kinds of new stuff. It creates the idea of like a civil society, like we all have to participate, we all have to do our job. It leads towards things like voting and individual rights. What are my rights within society? Before the idea of popular sovereignty becomes common, people aren't necessarily thinking like that. They're not thinking about their rights within society. What happens if your leader's bad? If the king is evil, there's nothing really you can do about it unless you want to try and kill the king. If the president is evil, you can vote and you can change the president, right? So there's a lot of sort of change that goes on, and governments are going to try to prevent some of this change, right? The king doesn't want to be replaced with a prime minister or something. So these ideas are censored, and that makes them even more opposed to censorship, right? If the state's supposed to be working for the people, then the people should be informed so that they know how to elect their leaders, so that they know how to participate in society, so they know the laws, all these sorts of things. And under these sorts of states, in popularly sovereign states, if everybody is a citizen, or if everyone's a participant, then there's more of a reason that everyone should be equal. So with the idea of popular sovereignty comes all kinds of ideas about legal equality, political autonomy, all of these sorts of things. And the founding fathers, the members of the French Revolution that we'll look at in Haiti and in Latin America, people are really excited about these ideas. And this is the big drive for why you might want to change your government in the first place. You don't want to be beholden to a king. You might want to actually be involved in the government yourself. So combining all of these ideas from the Enlightenment, we can start to look at the American Revolution more in a sort of world history context. This was the first, big revolution on the back of these Enlightenment ideas, freedom, equality, popular sovereignty, right? Ideas about democracy, not having a king, sound very familiar to us because they're sort of the founding mythology of the United States, why we exist. And after the American Revolution, this is sort of like a bell for everyone around the Atlantic. We're going to see a sort of pattern emerge based on what happens in the United States. So the first thing you might want to think about when you're thinking about the American Revolution is, in some ways, it was really unexpected. In other ways, not so much, but if you go to maybe 1750, most people in the colonies are British. They feel British, they speak English, they use British cultural objects the same as anybody in Britain. Britain's on the rise globally, right? People want to be associated with Britain. It's the most powerful empire in the world within a few years. They just won the 7 Years' War against France. They beat up the other big European power, right? But when they do that, the British government finds that it needs a lot more money. A 7-year war might be very expensive. So the British government makes a choice that in retrospect might not have been great. They decide the way they're going to pay off that war and kind of stay on top is just by raising taxes on all of their colonies. Well, as it turns out, a lot of people in the 13 colonies, in particular in the Americas, don't like these taxes. One of the big early ones was the Sugar Act in 1764, right, taxing sugar. The next year was the Stamp Act, taxing stamps. And this caused quite a problem for people in the United States. Here's a fun little section off of a letter. This is the place to affix the stamp, right? So like you can see, even when people were mailing things, they were protesting the Stamp Act. They didn't want to pay more taxes. Also, people were opposed to quartering troops, meaning that the British government during the war had required that individuals house soldiers. And this was sort of a big problem. If you were a middle class or elite person, you certainly didn't want a bunch of British troops like hanging out in your manor or on your plantation, taking up your space and time and eating your food. So there was a certain sort of resentment amongst the elites in the colonies about the way that the British were treating them. Also, there was a growing sort of distance in between people in the colonies and the metropole back in the United Kingdom. It took, weeks to get across the Atlantic. People often didn't go back and forth. Most of the people in the 13 colonies would have been settlers that were permanently here. And thus, slowly there's a sort of cultural drift. People are becoming something else. And that new identity is just starting to form that's distinctly different from the British identity. So in the midst of all these sorts of things, the British keep trying to sort of tighten their control. They notice changes in the empire. They notice the 13 colonies are getting a little bit restless about stamps and taxes and quartering troops, these sorts of things. So the British government is going to try to rein that in. But sometimes that's no good, right? If you try to grab sand really hard, you lose it all. So as the British government is doing this, colonial leaders become more adamant in wanting representation in the British Parliament, that they should not have to pay any new taxes unless they get to at least have some sort of debate or say over how these taxes are paid or where they're collected. This leads to a wave of boycotts and sort of physical attacks on the British. The most famous one, obviously, being the Boston Tea Party in 1773. I'm not sure why we don't call it a riot, probably because we like it. But the Boston Tea Party is a bunch of Americans. These would have been overwhelmingly white New Englanders getting dressed up, pretending to be Native Americans, and attacking British personal property and destroying a lot of property in the name of their revolution. Now, actually, Americans are really against this, right? And if you've obviously been watching the news recently or anything, the destruction of personal property is seen as like absolutely horrible. But the early American revolutions were definitely founded on it. Also, That tea they're dumping into the harbor would have been green tea that would have just been coming from China. So that's kind of funky, right? It's a little bit different. The British drank green tea, not black tea like we think today, all that sort of stuff. This led to other avenues. You don't just want people rioting, so you start to get more sort of political pressure as well. So for example, in 1774, you have the formation of the Continental Congress, which was essentially groups of elite colonists who wanted to have some say over their own political matters and essentially just formed a union and did it themselves. You also have the opening salvos to the Revolutionary War. In 1775, things are getting real tense. There's been riots, there's been boycotts, there's been, elite Americans just breaking away and kind of trying to run their own government in a sense. So British soldiers came into conflict with some of these new Americans, and in Lexington, Massachusetts, some shots were fired. Even though it was a pretty small-scale skirmish, the war was on. It happened pretty quick after that. By July 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. The Founding Fathers and other revolutionary leaders had been working on it for a while. It's almost entirely based on the Enlightenment. If you read the sort of Declaration of Independence, you get things like all men are created equal, these sorts of things. This is very much just that direct Enlightenment thought, ideas about equality, freedom, progress, popular sovereignty. They're all baked into these documents, right? Government power is for the consent of the governed, right? Popular sovereignty. The colonies are free and independent states. So all of these things are sort of baked into that document. But it still takes a while to translate that all into what will become the sort of central legal documents of the United States, like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Those actually aren't all ratified until 1790. In between 1776 and 1790, you got to fight a war, right? So after the Declaration of Independence, then you got to fight a war against Britain. That takes a while. It occupies a lot of time. And then afterwards is when you actually start to write the Constitution and other articles like that. There you go, Bill of Rights for you. So during the Revolutionary War, there's all kinds of questions about who's going to side with who and why. It's not like everybody in the colonies was an American and suddenly decided not to be British anymore. There were different groups. One of the main groups was the Patriots, and these were the majority of sort of white males. These were people who wanted to be American, some kind of new thing, not British anymore. Then about 20% of the white population were loyalists or Tories. They wanted to stay British. And there's all kinds of reasons for this. You might have economic interests in London. You might be a new arrival. You might just feel British. You might be one of those people who goes back and forth. You might be married to someone who's from Europe, these sorts of things. You might think the Americans are going to lose, right? So there's all kinds of reasons people were loyalists. Then there's a whole other section of society, Quakers and other religious groups, that really wanted to remain neutral. The idea was, since they were outside of sort of politics and normal mundane life anyway, who cares? They, governments come and go, that's not for them. They would sort of sit on the sidelines. Native American groups were divided. They had been long attacked by the British or the French or the Spanish, and they had different sort of competing loyalties against each other, against the British, against the colonists. There were also a number of freedmen and slaves who were really ambivalent about the formation of the United States because all indications were that all of these white men who were arguing that they wanted their freedom and independence and equality also wanted to keep slaves. So most black folks did not want to necessarily be pro-America, but they weren't really necessarily pro-British either, although some were, like the black pioneers that we looked at before. So the state that wanted to keep them enslaved, was also fighting on the premise of equality. It's really complicated. Here's a little video that might be able to help you sort out some of these things. Oh yeah, here's first a guy getting tarred and feathered, but then here's a video to help you sort these things out.
Ah, hello to you, sirs. And to you, ladies.
These heels are almost impossible to walk in.
Well, get over it, dude. You gotta walk in, okay? Now, let me hear the voice.
No, I don't think that the voice is entirely necessary, so I'm not going to do it.
If we're gonna wipe away all traces of our colonial background and blend in with British culture, we need to walk the walk and we need to talk the talk.
Fine, how do you do it?
Your voice needs to come off as elegant as your clothing, okay? So, try this. Would you like a spot of tea? You. Yes.
Would you like a spot of tea? Yes.
Draw it out more.
Draw it out more than that.
Yes, yes.
More than that. Yes.
Yeah, but...
That's good.
You know, man, those wooden teeth are killing me, man. That lisp is stupid.
Well, I think the wooden teeth is the whole thing that's saving this thing.
You
for
sound
me.
ridiculous.
No, I don't. I think it sounds pretty good. I'm not losing the teeth. Let's just move past that.
Let's keep walking. Okay, try it again. Try it again.
Yes.
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 Good, good, good. Now, flourish the pinky.
Flourish the pinky.
Yes.
Well, what have we got here? A pair of puffs about town. Sodomites. In frilly lace.
No. Nath. No, we are simply two noble Britishmen out on a stroll.
Yes.
Good day, sir.
Good day.
Oh.
Boys, get the tar.
Shit.
Okay, so in that video, that you see a lot of stuff going on there. Basically, you could get in trouble in different parts for having the wrong loyalties. Things that used to be British that were really cool become effeminate. They become not cool anymore. You might get tarred and feathered. That sounds pretty horrible. So this is when Americans stop drinking tea, right, and start drinking coffee. Tea is British. It's no longer cool. Powdered wigs, right? We're British. So they're going to not be cool anymore pretty quickly, right? Stuff like that. So what was sort of more prominent in the colonies gets hyped up. What was less prominent gets like rejected. But at the same time, Americans, these new colonists that are forming a country, are going to stay sort of tapped in across the Atlantic. And they find a lot of allies in Europe. France, Spain, the Netherlands, a lot of other countries are going to support the colonies. Britain was quickly becoming the #1 sort of superpower in the world, so everybody was excited to see Britain kind of get a black eye. If Britain lost, that would be great. The French government is going to support the American Revolution, even though the French had a king and it seemed really odd they should support people rebelling against a king that might turn out to not be good for them. So all of these governments are going to give supplies, cash, soldiers. Some of them played really oversized roles, like this guy here, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a general. He was deeply involved in a lot of the sort of military actions against the British. He was a great aid to the United States. That's why everywhere you go, you'll see like Lafayette Street, Lafayette Park, Lafayette School, like all these sorts of things. They're left over, they're named after him. Without Lafayette, it's entirely possible the US wouldn't have won. He played a huge role in the sort of military situation. Yeah, there you go, going into battle. I'm not sure why they got that little kid drumming, man. He probably shouldn't be there. But the British found that Europeans were really excited to support the Americans. But that also ensures that those ideas are going to make their way back to Europe, and maybe that could be a problem. So George Washington, I'm sure you've heard about before, is the American general who's going to sort of lead the fight for the colonists and eventually become the first president. He did not have wooden teeth, as they're sort of making fun of in that video. He had teeth made from the teeth of a dead slave. Anywho, he was a great military strategist. But He was a great military strategist because he broke all the rules. Bluntly, he cheated. The British were still pretty invested in that sort of warfare where you line up and shoot at each other. He didn't do that all the time. He used a lot of other tactics. The people in the colonies had been fighting against Native Americans for 100 years, more than that. And they had learned a lot of what the Native Americans did were more effective, sort of hit and run tactics, sniper tactics. So the Americans used all of these tactics, and the British found them really distasteful, but they worked. Washington did a bunch of other stuff that's pretty questionable. Here he is crossing the Delaware. It's very romantic and heroic. But the real story is there was like a truce called for Christmas, and while all those British soldiers were nice and asleep in their beds or opening letters from home, Washington snuck across the river and attacked them and sort of massacred some British forces, even though he had agreed to a truce on that day. He also experimented on some of his soldiers. The first inoculation against smallpox was just being developed at this time. Basically, you find someone who's sick with smallpox, you scrape some of the pox off of their face, you dry it out, you grind it up, but the virus is still in there, you inject it into people. Some of them die, but the other ones are then immune from smallpox. So he did this to his soldiers, right? He experimented on them. And that tradition is very much alive in the military today. So this came to be sort of seen as this American way of war, kind of breaking the rules, doing whatever you need to win, relying on sort of unconventional tactics. And the rest of the world is going to pick this up from us for sure. Anywho, those unconventional tactics seem to work out with the help of Europeans, with the help of a lot of determination on the part of the colonists. The Americans win. By 1780, pretty much everybody's tired of war, and the British are quickly figuring out that they're just not going to win. In October 1781, the British forces end hostilities. There's no longer shooting on the ground for the most part. But it takes years before there's actually an official sort of treaty settlement. It's not until 1783 in Paris that the war officially ends and the US is independent. This painting is from that conference where the war officially ends, and it really shows sort of some of the weird suddenness of the end after like years of waiting. At the conference, the Americans were supposed to sit and be painted, and then the British were supposed to sit and be painted, right? And then you would have one sort of painting that showed the conference and like the ending of the war, but the British just refused to sit for it. So you only get like the American portion. The painting was never finished. But it really sort of shows the animosity and the way things were left. Either way, by 1783, you have a new United States. Here it is at the time that the war kind of stopped in terms of shooting. The United States, 1781. You'll notice there's no Florida yet, right? That's part of the Spanish Empire. Or actually, by 1781, that's still part of the British Empire. Spanish Louisiana, Quebec, right, is like a French speaking sort of independent-y place. It's kind of weird. So the US is a small country in this like big new continent. It hasn't, expanded yet. That's something different for the future. So at about the same time that the revolution is wrapping up in the United States, we see an equally strong independent movement developing in France. However, the French Revolution is going to build, on top of all of those American ideas, but it's going to get a lot more radical more quickly. Society in some ways is going to be turned upside down in a more sort of severe way. So a lot of this stems from France's financial problems. By the 1780s, half of all the money of the state was going to pay off war debt. So that's an incredible amount. That's from the 7 Years' War, but other stuff as well. So King Louis XVI had a great idea. We'll just make a new tax on the nobility. So all the aristocrats and barons and whatever, no problem. We'll just take a little bit more of their money. Well, just like in the American case, in a sense, elites don't like to pay more taxes. Uh, you know, it's just not what they're hip to. So the aristocrats protest. All the sort of noble people, they don't want to pay more taxes. So they do something that hadn't been done in kind of a long time. They summon all the estates of France. And this was kind of a weird, like, government relic. Basically, there were three different estates. The Roman Catholic clergy was one estate, the nobles were one estate, and then the rest of the population. But by the rest of the population, I really mean like middle class merchants and stuff like that, not the potato farmers. So each estate was supposed to get a vote in sort of broader debates about what would happen with the kingdom. They argue about the taxes, and to everybody's surprise, the third estate shows up in force, and they want a lot of changes too. Those ideas from the United States about popular sovereignty, freedom and equality, Declaration of Independence, that had been working into the mind of the middle class French. And at this conference, they're kind of all together, or the sort of representatives are all together, scheming, changing notes, talking about these problems. And that gets out of hand pretty quickly. In the 17th of June, 1789, the Third Estate just says, look, we're going to do our own thing. Aristocrats are sitting around arguing over money with the king. It's dumb. We don't need it. We're going to do a new thing. We're going to form a new government. We're just going to do our own. They proclaim themselves the National Assembly. So they basically just proclaim a new kind of parliamentary system. They didn't ask. They didn't participate with the current government. They just break away. A couple days later, a lot of these guys meet up at a tennis court, very famously, and they swear the tennis court oath not to leave before they have like a new constitution and a new sort of functioning government apparatus. But stuff doesn't go well. Obviously, the aristocrats didn't intend for this to happen. They don't want it. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't really want it. The monarchy doesn't want it. So the French government mobilizes to kind of crush this new government that's saying it exists. But this new government that's saying it exists doesn't want that, so they fight back. Namely, they attack the Bastille, which is a sort of arms depot and jail in Paris. And when they attack the Bastille, people get carried away. Originally, they just want to get the weapons out of there, but they start freeing some of the prisoners. They kill the guards, and it's a lot sort of worse than was intended necessarily. But when that happens, it's sort of like just throwing a bomb in the middle of the mix, and people all over the country react, and there's a sort of general insurgency that starts. So what is this new government going to look like? It's declared itself. It kind of has an idea of what it wants to be. In 1789, they come up with their own sort of Declaration of Independence, and they call it the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. So what are the rights of men in this new French world? They have liberty, equality, fraternity, right? It abolishes the power of landlords and the church. It gets rid of the nobles completely. It removes all of the legislative authority from the king, meaning the king can't just make laws anymore. There will be some sort of voting. Men of property, which was about half of adult males, got the chance to vote on sort of public policy. So this is a lot more democratic, much more sort of radical than what was going on before, and a really big affront to the traditional sort of power players in France. This is something completely new. So this new government is formed. They have an idea of what they want to be. They're appealing to the people. But of course, the King of France and the monarchy, they're not on board. The nobles who lose their titles, they don't want this. So they're going to push back, and there's going to be a war, essentially, between these new French people who see themselves as having a government totally independent from what was there before and the previous government. As it turns out, this time, all of the foreign powers, the other European nations, are going to try and support the King of France. So remember, in the American Revolution, the King of France supported the revolutionaries. Everybody wanted to see Britain get hurt. In this case, this is a little too close to home. It's too close to comfort. All of these other kings are looking over and saying, whoa, we don't want our people to think this is a good idea. We better help the French monarchy shut this whole thing down. So all of the other European powers support the French monarchy. So the National Assembly says, okay, you want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. 1792, the National Assembly declares war on Spain, Austria, Prussia, Britain, the Netherlands, everybody, right? If they're still supporting the French king, war is coming for you. This seems really crazy, but their goal was to really send a clear message that this wasn't just a sort of temporary thing. This wasn't like a renegotiation of how the monarchy was going to work. They really just wanted to get rid of the monarchy, and if other people wanted to support them or something, that's no good. So this National Assembly, their goal was pretty clear. They want to get rid of the monarchy, and they want a new republic. Well, you need some stuff for that. You need a lot of soldiers. So a new sort of part of the French idea is universal conscription, meaning everybody's in the military. You have to pick sides. Are you going to fight for the revolution and for France and for this new National Assembly? Are you going to fight for the monarchy and to try to keep the repressive system? There's no in between. And when there's no in between, people get really radical, right? You start to see enemies everywhere. If they're not with you, they're against you, right? This leads to a pretty horrifying time because this new state is not interested in prisoners. It's not interested in black and white. It's interested in the sort of goal of the state. So if you want to get rid of the monarchy, the first thing you might do is just kill them. So in 1793, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are executed publicly. They're dragged out of their palace in Versailles and have their heads chopped off and put on spikes, right? A pretty clear message that the monarchy is over. But it's not just the monarchy. There's all kinds of other people that might be sort of in the way of the revolution. So you might want to deal with these people, and the person in charge of dealing with these people was Maximilien Robespierre, who formed the Committee for Public Safety. With a name like that, right, you know it's got to be good. The job of the Committee for Public Safety was to root out any enemies of the state and make sure they were ineffective, whether that was killing them, whether that was imprisoning them. And this led to just a crazy sort of reign of terror, where the new government, even though they were excited about getting rights to people and promoting the new state and like raising the quality of life for the French man, first they got to chop off a lot of heads. And this is sometimes referred to as the cult of reason, because all of these people were invested in the Enlightenment. They were looking for freedom. They were looking for democracy. They were looking for, to support these sort of natural laws within society, right? Very reasonable. But within about a year and a half, they'd executed maybe 40,000 people. So heads were flying off left and right. Hundreds of thousands of people were imprisoned, basically awaiting execution, whether they got executed or not. So a really sort of terrible time. There you go, some people being executed. So out of this mess, during the Reign of Terror, someone else is going to sort of step up to lead the revolution in a new direction, and that's Napoleon Bonaparte. Here he is there. He kind of looks like me. That's good. Or maybe I look like him. I'm not sure. Yeah. He was a really brilliant military general. He had fought frequently against foreigners. He had been deployed outside of Europe. He had invaded Egypt previously in 1798 or something like that. Yeah, 98. And he was in Egypt. He hears about what's going on, the sort of reign of terror and these sorts of things. He goes back to France and he overthrows the new government. When he does this, he has himself crowned emperor of France, a new France. He makes peace with the Pope. The Pope had been upset about all the stuff that was going on there. And he promulgates a civil code. He says legal equality for all men, protection of private property, all these other liberal ideas that seem to be in line with what the National Assembly wanted. However, he was not such a liberal dude. Proclaiming yourself emperor, right, is maybe not so liberal. It's very much more authoritarian, and it says the state will work for me, not for you. So it's kind of a mix. Also, people don't particularly like what he's doing in France. Remember, France is at war with a bunch of foreign powers. When Napoleon takes over, it's not like that changes. The wars are still going on. So he is, however, a brilliant military general. He's able to marshal the French forces, and he just humiliates these other European powers. He beats up on Spain, he beats up on Prussia, he beats up on the Austrians, and is very successful. When he does this, France is able to keep some of its like imperial territory, and we'll kind of see that's going to play a role later. Places like Haiti, places like the Americas, right? France is going to have a big chunk of sort of overseas colonial possessions for a while. But Napoleon gets greedy and he makes a mistake that you should never make in Europe. He invades Russia. Russia, as you might know, gets really cold in the winter. Also, it's very far away sometimes. So Napoleon is beating up all these European powers. He decided to go for it and attack Russia. It turns out to not be good. He gets really beat up. Then the Europeans kind of wise up the other Europeans and think we should really kind of gang up on this guy. He's getting nuts. So other European powers get together and beat him in a couple battles. He is forced to abdicate his position. He escapes. He tries it one more time at this battle at Waterloo, and he loses. And it's like, it's very clear it's over. He gets arrested. He gets put under house arrest. He's shipped off to this island in the Atlantic, where he later died, maybe from arsenic poisoning from the sort of natural arsenic in the wallpaper in his room that he never left. So not a very glamorous end, but it's really confusing because it's like, what happened to the revolution? You have this monarchy, there's a revolution. The revolution kind of got hijacked by Napoleon, but then Napoleon's out. So it's 1815, Napoleonic France is over, right? What's going to be there instead? Well, actually, it's going to remain to be seen. All of the sort of new ideas about government are going to stick. The monarchy's kind of gone. If you chop the heads off of all the ruling class, it's hard to bring them back. So we'll kind of catch up with them a little bit later. But these revolutions in the United States and in France, built on liberal ideas and ideology, but not necessarily always following those tracks, are going to really inspire other revolutionaries around the world. In particular, next time we're going to look at revolutions that happened in the Caribbean and then in Latin America that are going to be based in the same way that France based theirs in some ways on the United States. Haiti is going to look towards France and the United States for independence, even though they're getting independence from France. Then Latin American countries are going to follow suit. So we'll see these Atlantic revolutions continue to sort of reverberate around and drive one another. So next time, we'll look at these Atlantic revolutions in Haiti and Spanish America. So keep reading, let me know if you have any questions, and then see you next time.